about our recording solution and third-party quality assurance services, visit comelectronics.com. This webinar is part of our public safety education series, and you can view our upcoming webinars on our training page at comelectronics.com/training. And I apologize for the barking dog. Okay, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. And I'm going to do it. Come on now. There we go. Okay, if you're listening in using your computer speaker system, you're automatically muted to eliminate background noise. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select the handset in the audio pane at the bottom right, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can submit questions about today's lesson at any time by typing your questions into the Q&A pane in the control panel, and I will address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The best time to do that is when you think of them. Now, once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd really appreciate it if you would complete that and let us know how we did so we can continue to provide you with relevant content. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. For those wanting to report this training to their state certification or licensing agency, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. My name is Beth English, and I'm your instructor today. I began my 911 career as a police dispatcher 32 years ago. I was very young, and most recently served as a communications director before joining Commercial Electronics as the program manager for their QA/QI program and HighGround instructor. I have my master's telecommunicator license from Texas. I'm a TCOLE instructor and a past president of Texas NENA. I currently serve on the Texas APCO board as the secondary CCAM. So let's get started with our session. First, let's talk about what documentation is. We're all familiar with DORs and annual evaluations, but what else is included? Personnel documents such as employment applications, drug screen results, background investigations, etc., are all considered forms of documentation. And documentation is the written and retained record of employment events, such as an employee's actions, discussions, performance coaching, policy violations, and disciplinary action. Documentation should also include positive contributions, such as rewards and recognition, goals that were accomplished, and any other noted behavior above and beyond the norm. So let's start with the basics. Whether you make this available to your employees in hard copy or online, every agency should have an employee handbook. This is the collection of rules and procedures that are mandatory for all employees of the employing city or county. A policy manual, a collection of policies strictly for those employees of the agency, the entity, the department to be used in addition to the employee handbook. A procedure manual, which is step-by-step instructions for every process or procedure performed by the employee. This is the hardest to maintain, as procedures can change daily depending on equipment, software updates, outages, things like that. And the NCIC manual or your state CIC manual. Probably enough said about that. These are documents that ensure your employees know what is expected of them, what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do, how to perform the processes of the job, and the all-important NCIC rules that you just do not break, like sending a YQ on a no-ex warrant. Now, granted, maintaining the policy and procedure documents is often easier said than done. Those are often the first things to be obsolete and the last things to get updated. With personnel shortages, massive overtime, it's often impossible to make the time to revamp your policy manual or your procedure manual. If your agency's in this boat, it might be time to look at hiring some outside help to get these updated. So why is documentation so important? One problem with maintaining documentation is that not everyone understands why it's important. First, it's necessary because it provides a written record to support any actions taken, such as promotions or demotions, pay raises, and disciplinary actions up to and including termination. But it can also show what steps an employer has taken to help an employee succeed. Now, you may have heard my famous saying, if it ain't writ, it didn't happen. Try defending a grievance or wrongful termination suit without appropriate documentation, and you'll find out about its importance the hard way. So we know this. We know that documentation is important. Why don't we do it? Well, no one likes to do it because it's not easy to do if it's going to be done right, and it must be done right. It also has to be done immediately after an incident in order to get all the details in the documentation, and frankly, we tend to get lazy when it comes to keeping track of events. If you've ever trained, you know the DORs have to be done each and every day that someone's in training. But how many of you have been so ready to leave at the end of a shift that you decided to wait to do the DOR until the next day? Except when the next day came, you couldn't remember what happened the day before. So what do? You give the trainee minimal acceptable scores, and you move on to the next DOR. The problem with that is that documentation should be done as quickly as possible after an event in order to keep from forgetting details such as date, time, context of the conversation, details of the incident, and other pertinent information. So the longer you wait to document an incident, the less likely it is to be accurate. Now, since documentation is about the good, the bad, and the ugly, whether it's about the employee or the employer, it isn't just for supervisory personnel anymore. Trainees, CTOs, frontline employees, supervisors, managers, and directors should all keep documentation. Obviously, any type of harassment or discriminatory behavior on the part of the employer should be documented. One trap we find ourselves falling into is brushing things off that bother us. We don't want to rock the boat, or we think, well, maybe they didn't mean it that way. Sometimes something may start out as a joke, and we initially think it's funny, but then the joke starts to go too far, and suddenly it isn't funny anymore. We should never wait until something becomes intolerable before we start documenting, because you never know when it's going to get intolerable. Office jokes, whether verbal or physical, have a way of getting out of hand pretty quickly, and if you don't have yourself covered with documentation, you won't be able to do anything about it. So this is about covering more than just your agency. You also want to document any policy violations that you encounter. Yes, I know. We don't want to report our friends, but that kind of thinking can get you into trouble. For instance, let's say that you find out an officer is going home in the middle of his shift to take a nap, but he checks out on a quote-unquote vacation watch. But since you know he's at home taking a nap, you call him at home when you get a robbery call at the local stop and steal. His naps eventually come to light, and during the investigation, it also comes to light that you knew about it and you covered for him. Now, you may lose your job and your career because not only did you not report a policy violation, but you also participated in it. So you have to decide if this friendship is worth your livelihood or not. And each of these harassment, discrimination, policy violations, each of these requires listing the activity or the activities that took place. You're going to list the employees engaged in the activity. You want to list the witnesses. You want to get the gist of the conversation or conversations or remarks, or verbatim if you can remember them. You want to get the time, the location, the circumstances, and also any responses that you had to these incidents. So know also and list which policies and or laws that were violated. With Google, you can Google any of these harassment, discrimination, policy violations, and you can come up with the actual law. With your employee handbook, you can look up which policies that were violated. If there are emails or social media posts, you want to provide copies. And when you turn in your notes with your complaint, you want to make copies and turn in the copies, but keep all your originals. So, for example, here's something I wrote up as an example. 12/12/2019, 15:16 hours. City Policy 912.13, sexual harassment. Lieutenant Smith passed me in the hall by the break room and said, "You look nice today, but you would be much more attractive if you lost weight." I didn't respond. TC Ben Jones witnessed the remark. Okay? This is date, time, policy, what was said, who witnessed it, what your response was. Now, keep in mind that one incident of poor behavior may not be indicative of more of the same to come, but it might. So if this type of behavior becomes a habit, you're covered because you have the documentation. If this never happens again, then you've lost nothing by documenting it. So let's talk about what trainees should document. Just because their work is documented in the DORs, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't also keep documentation. They have a stake in the workings of the Communication Center just as much as anyone else does. So what should they be documenting? Well, one thing that they might want to document is issues with their DORs. Now, before you get your feathers ruffled, I'm not advocating for trainees to rise up and overthrow the agency. However, every one of you was a trainee at one time or another. And more than likely, when you think back on your training, you probably wish you had documented some things that happened to you while you were training. Whether it was how a trainer treated you or a policy or procedure you were trained on that maybe wasn't right. We all know that just because a trainer says something doesn't mean it's always so. So if a trainee has questions about their training, not only should they bring it up, but they should document it. So one practice to facilitate this would be to allow the trainee to add comments to their DORs. So this doesn't mean giving them an open forum to air all their complaints. They can make note of any questions they have about procedures, low ratings, or even about how they think their training is going and what they think they need to improve on. But what about the days when the trainee's regular CTO is off duty and they're assigned to a different CTO? So their regular trainer tells them to ask questions in a specific order. but their interim CTO tells them it should be done another way. I'm sure most of you have been through that. So what should the trainee do? Again, they need to bring it up to their supervisor or their regular CTO and document the conflicting information they were given. And this covers them in the event that at some point they're told by management that they're doing something wrong. And just like any other employee, trainees should document any bad treatment by coworkers. I've said before that after I had children, I understood why some animals eat their young, but I've never understood why we do it in communications. I know that as a trainee, I was bullied, and I'm sure a lot of you were bullied, and I've seen some bad instances of bullying as a director. Trainees need to understand that they're not expected to tolerate that type of behavior and that they should document any instances of it as soon as it happens. They also need to know that they can bring that information forward without fear of retaliation. And I know that's easier said than done. We can tell them till the cows come home that they need to bring information to us if they're being mistreated or anything like that. But I know that a lot of trainees are afraid of retaliation. They're afraid of losing their job if they say something against a golden employee, etc. So they need to understand from the beginning that they are allowed to bring information forward. Now, what about frontline employees? One thing every telecommunicator should be doing is documenting their training hours. I know that some agencies have training coordinators specifically for keeping up with the training of all the employees and what classes they've taken and stuff, but that doesn't absolve any employee of their responsibility. So just like insurance and taxes, it is a personal responsibility, not the agency's. The same goes for any required certifications for the job. If you're an EMD agency, you know telecommunicators have to have 24 hours of continuing education every 2 years to maintain that certification. If their certification expires because the agency didn't keep track of it, the association doesn't keep the agency from operating, but the telecommunicator is no longer legally able to process EMD calls until that certification is renewed. Again, this is a personal responsibility, and the only way to keep up with it is to document what, where, and when. Any time taken off and any overtime worked should also be documented by the employee. Most of us have some type of time card, whether it's written or it's in a computer program that the agency uses. And generally, whatever method you use is going to be checked for accuracy by a supervisor at some point. And for the most part, there will be no problems. But nothing is 100%, and you should be keeping track of your hours just in case there's a question about it later. CTOs have one of the most important roles when it comes to documentation. And this brings us to the meat of our session. The documentation that CTOs are responsible for determines not only whether a trainee should be retained or not, but can also be useful or detrimental to the agency in defending a termination. The same goes for supervisors. They too have more documentation responsibilities than anyone else. Not only do they have to keep up with all the general documentation that all employees must do, like we just discussed, hours, training, certifications, etc., but they also have to maintain documentation on all employees for evaluation purposes, disciplinary actions, and termination recommendations. So let's talk about how this documentation must be done in order to cover your agency. The first thing that you have to have in place in order to bulletproof your documentation is clear expectations for your employees. You have to start with a job description that details exactly what the employee's job entails. It should include all physical aspects of the job, as well as the mental aspects, hours, vacation, holidays, time off, etc. All the good things about the job. In one previous agency that I worked for, we also had what we called a realistic job preview. And we had every applicant sign the realistic job preview. And this detailed all of the things that an employee could expect working in communications. Everything we could possibly think of. So we included the shift work, no breaks, mandatory overtime, sitting for hours at a time, utter chaos, total boredom, wearing headsets, uniforms, you name it. Anything we could think of. We included anything that would come up. So no one could ever say that they weren't told this. They weren't told to expect that. So having these in place with an employee's signature starts your documentation. And something you always want to avoid is having an employee hear about something for the first time when they read it in a disciplinary report that you've written. Now, we want to document immediately, like I stated earlier, as soon as possible after an incident or behavior, not just for the employee's benefit, but for yours also. The longer you wait to document, the less likely you are to remember everything that happened or was said, especially if you tend to go home and imbibe after a rough day. So another reason you want to document immediately is because if the employee doesn't know something is wrong, they can't fix it. For instance, an employee walks in the door for her shift at exactly 0700 hours. You don't say anything, but for the next 3 shifts, she comes in at exactly 0700 hours. On the 4th occurrence, you give her a written notice that she needs to be at work on time. Now, as far as she knows, she has been. But because you didn't say anything until after the 4th occurrence, she didn't have a chance to correct her behavior before you wrote her up. Had you mentioned it the first day, she would have corrected it and been on time the rest of the week. So don't wait until a behavior becomes a habit before you decide to address it. No one likes to be in trouble, but your employees need to know if they're not meeting expectations and are in jeopardy of progressive discipline. It's your responsibility as an employer, trainer, or supervisor to communicate this to them and to document it so that they understand their actions can and will have consequences. And in this line of work, the consequences can be far more dire than just losing their job. Documentation also makes the problem real for them. A verbal counseling for some is all you need. Like for me, that's all I would need is a verbal counseling. And I would probably go home crying from that. But for others, you need to take more drastic action for it to impact them. Knowing that you've documented their behavior and it's in their employment file will cause most of them to react differently. Now, granted, this isn't true for everyone, but for most employees, it makes a difference. And it also sets an example for the rest of the employees. No one wants to be made an example of, but it does make an impact. It shows the rest of the employees that you're serious about the standards that you've set and that you will follow through with holding people accountable. Employees are going to test you at every opportunity, especially if you're a new supervisor. They will deliberately go against policies just to see what you'll do. Even more so if you were friends before you were promoted. And that's where it gets tough. You will need to document the actions just as you would for a new employee who just started. So it may come down to it's either me or them, and you will have to decide if your job is worth ignoring the behavior. Excuse me. Now, when you're documenting employee behavior actions, you want to focus only on the facts as you know them, whether you're documenting good behavior or bad. You want to describe the behavior that you want to change or keep and not the individual. You don't want to speculate or include unverified information. For example, John called in sick after staying out late at his weekly poker game. Okay? What you may not know is that John stayed out late because he was with his wife at the emergency room and not out at his weekly poker game. You also want to avoid using broad judgments such as always and never. These words are easily defended by an attorney. You want to state specific facts such as dates a behavior occurred, and you want to use, you don't want to use what's called filler words because they will get you in trouble and they can be disputed. And I don't know how many of you, when you have disagreements with your spouse, if your spouse tells you that you always do something or you never do something, that just makes me mad. It makes me madder than I was to begin with. So, if it affects you that way at home, it's going to affect your employees the same way at work. Now, you want to watch for patterns of disruptive behavior. Sometimes you'll have an employee who doesn't ever do anything bad enough to get in serious trouble, but they're a trouble employee. So one day they may enter a call with the incorrect address. The next day they come to work late. A week later they forget to complete their timesheet and add their overtime. A couple of weeks later they're 15 minutes late coming back from a break. They haven't done anything more than once, so there's no progressive discipline to be done, as there would be if they had been late to work 3 or 4 times. So what do? You look for patterns of problem behavior, which you can only do if you've documented these incidents as you should have. If your city or county policy has a section on behaviors that are fundamentally inconsistent with employment, then you would include that policy number in your documentation about the employee's behavior. Now, patterns of behavior that you'll want to watch for that can disrupt the center and create risks for others and the organization are unsatisfactory attendance. So this will include frequently calling in sick on their Friday or their Monday, excessive tardiness or needing to leave early frequently. It can include failure to attend off-site training or failure to attend mandatory meetings. Indifference towards their job or their work. So this could include repeated neglect of duty or carelessness, lack of initiative, or lack of cooperation with coworkers or supervisors. And I know as I'm telling all this, you each have a name in mind. It could include engaging in personal, non-work-related activities during work hours, and failure to maintain licenses or certifications. Gossiping. Sometimes gossiping is harmless, and sometimes it is vicious. However, either can affect the morale of the department, whether it's factual or not. For example, I had an employee once who texted a picture of a very attractive applicant to several male officers before I had even hired her. And although it wasn't done viciously, it was detrimental to the department because officers were lined up at the door on her first day on the job. She was flattered, other employees were aggravated, and I had to have officers banned from communications. Bullying is another one. This generally doesn't include uncivil behavior in the workplace. Bullying normally takes place in the form of isolation, condescending communications, manipulation. It's about someone having power over someone else who seems weaker than the bully. The problem with bullying is that you don't know it's happening unless someone tells you. However, once someone is willing to spill the beans, you've got to immediately start the investigation and the documentation. Insubordination. This includes failing to comply with written or oral instructions or perform work as assigned by a supervisor. Now, this can be a single event that's worthy of termination, or it can be a series of lesser events that undermines a supervisor's authority over time. So, for example, I had a dispatcher get angry one day, and she got up from the dispatch radio, took off her headset, and walked out the door. And nobody knew about it. So that one was a one-time incident, totally worthy of termination. But let's say that there's a series of lesser events. So let's say that the fire department is dispatched to a major accident in which a firefighter gets injured. So when the fire chief was asked about the accident the next day, he knew nothing about it. So a new policy is established that requires dispatchers to notify the fire chief by phone every time the fire department responds to any major accident. It's a policy that's basically intended to keep the fire chief from looking stupid in the media, but it is a huge burden on the dispatchers. And one dispatcher says it's a stupid policy and she refuses to follow it. So she just dispatches the fire department to multiple accidents without notifying the fire chief. Regardless of whether you agree with her or not, your job as a supervisor is to uphold the policies. So you have to document this as insubordination. Dishonesty. This includes maybe taking city or other employees' property. There's always the lunch that comes up missing or food comes missing out of the freezer. It can also include falsifying reports or documents and falsifying time records. And most of these are actions for which an employee can be terminated, except maybe stealing food out of the freezer. However, some of these instances that have been done over a period of time, and they should be documented each time. So, for instance, you have an employee who continuously signs up for overtime, but then fails to show up. Either they just fail to show up, or they call and say they can't do it, and somebody else has to do the overtime. But she also fails to remove the overtime hours from her timesheet, so she gets paid for time she didn't work. Now, done far enough apart, these can look like isolated incidences. But if you document them the way you should, then you will be able to see a pattern through this documentation that over a period of 4 months, there were 3 times that she was paid for overtime she didn't work. So documentation is not just about covering your agency, but it's also about seeing patterns of behavior. And then disturbances. An actual fight in communications is the least likely to occur, but it has and it can. But disturbance can also include continued use of profanity after having been directed to cease, spreading false rumors, and making disparaging remarks about leadership. Social media posts could also be included in this category, and as you know, many have lost their jobs because of social media posts. So these are just a few of the behaviors that can be detrimental to your center if allowed to continue. Even if you decide that everyone gets one freebie, the first occurrence needs to be noted so that if it continues, you can show it as a pattern. And remember, when documenting these behaviors, you want to stay away from judgments such as Dave has anger issues or Jim is a troublemaker. These are personal judgments, and besides being unverifiable, they put the employee on the defensive and they'll hinder any progress you hope to achieve with them. You also don't want to make the mistake of thinking a good employee would instinctively know what to do to correct their behavior or even know that their behavior is problematic in the first place. Instead, you want to focus on the actual behavior, how it violates policy, and the consequences for the violation. So I put an example up here. This is just one I just wrote. So on January 27th, 2020 at 11:52 hours, Jim failed to follow policy when dealing with a hysterical 911 caller who was unable to give her address. He told the caller, "I'm not going to help you if you don't shut up the crying and give me your address." Although the caller was able to calm herself and provide the needed information, Jim violated Communications Policy 17.102, calming the caller. Employees will use repetitive persistence to calm callers. At no time will a telecommunicator raise his or her voice, use profanity, or disconnect from an uncooperative caller. So this is Jim's third violation of communications policy in dealing with callers. He previously violated policy. Again, I've stated the policy number, and again, I've given date, time, exactly what he did, and the CFS number, call for service. You may have a different terminology for your numbers. And then again, date, time, what he did, exactly what he said, and the CFS number. And then a paragraph here about the fact that these three instances is a pattern. It occurred in a short span of time. He was counseled for the first one. He was given a written warning for the second, and he's still doing it. So now he's going to be placed on a 6-month performance improvement plan, during which time any further policy violations will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. And then I show that there's an attachment, and it's a performance improvement plan, which we will be discussing shortly. Now, in your documentation, you want to include any explanations the employee gives for the behavior. I know that your first thought is, you mean excuses. But sometimes there really is an explanation that, if explored early enough, could have kept the employee from acting inappropriately in the first place. Years ago, I worked for an agency that wore uniforms during the week, but on weekends, they let us wear casual clothes. And one year, for reasons unknown, one of the supervisors cut that privilege. Now, shortly after that, one of our most excellent employees started being disruptive, complaining all the time about different things, refusing to follow policies, and stopped talking to anyone. There was no interaction with any other employees while she was at work. So several incidents were documented, and when it came time to put her on a PIP, she finally admitted that she had been disruptive and acting out the way she had because she was so upset that the decision was made to take away that one privilege we had without the supervisor even asking any of those who worked on the weekends for input. It was basically something that was decided by someone who didn't work weekends and hadn't for almost 20 years. So once she gave her explanation, and the supervisor who had made that decision realized that she had made a mistake in taking away a privilege, she reversed her decision and she reinstated casual weekends. Now, the employee had still spent weeks being disruptive, and her behavior was still documented and she was still placed on a PIP, but it was shortened from 3 months to just 1. But as you can see, you know, sometimes there's a reason behind what's happening with an employee, and you need to take that into an account and also document it. Rushing to judgment about an employee can backfire you, and getting their input shows that you've attempted to be fair by learning how to help them. Now, whether you're meeting with an employee to discipline them or just meeting with them because you noticed a policy violation and want to correct it before it gets out of hand, you'll need to have a detailed plan of action ready for that employee. Even if you're putting them on a PIP, you can use this opportunity as a coaching session to turn their behavior around. So you want to give the employee specific steps to improve with deadlines, and you want to tell them what you're going to do to help. So let's say that you have an employee who fails to enter all the information on a stolen vehicle entry. They enter the VIN, but they don't bother to enter the LP, and you get 3 $. Messages from NCIC. This causes her coworkers to have to correct her entries. So you're going to counsel her, and you're going to document it. Your steps for improvement might include having her read the section of the NCIC manual regarding stolen vehicles and a copy of it placed in her file with her signature and the date on it. You also have her check other employees' work to see how they did their vehicle entries. And you might send her on a ride-along with a traffic officer so she can see the importance of having the LP entered as opposed to just the VIN. So this would be a coaching session and time to turn her behavior around. Now, putting an employee on a PIP is similar in that you will have a detailed plan of action for the employee. The biggest difference is that if an employee fails at any part of the PIP, they can be terminated. The PIP also goes in the employee's file in the department and in HR. Now, with a PIP, you will be documenting one of 2 types of behaviors, either substandard performance or misconduct. So substandard performance includes things such as failure to get complete info on 911 calls, failure to provide complete info on dispatched calls, the biggie, failure to verify addresses, failure to follow protocols, and incorrect NCIC entries, and this is just to name a few. The misconduct would include things like we've talked about earlier, the gossiping, tardiness, excessive use of sick leave, harassment, and bullying. You will want to keep in mind, though, that the goal of this plan is to help the employee to improve his job performance and be successful. So this is an example of a PIP that I've done. Now, your city, your county, your agency may have a specific form to use for PIPs. This is just one that I've done. So all names, dates, and places in this thing have been changed to protect me. In the example, you can see that the performance or issues are stated here with dates, times, actions, witnesses, and when the employee was notified of the issue. For example, the first one, December 12, 2019 at 1600 hours, you left work before checking all NCIC entries, causing your coworkers to complete them. This was discussed with you the next day, December 13, 2019 at 0900. Okay? The employee's expectations are clearly stated, as well as the expected employee actions. And these are the actions that he will need to take to correct his performance. I've also included any actions here that I intend to take as a manager, and I've also listed the consequences if he fails to improve. You'll also notice here this statement at the very bottom here, that he must continue this correct behavior after the PIP is finished, or he can still be terminated. So you want to make sure that the employee knows that he can't fly straight for 90 days and then go back to his old habits. He must maintain that performance standard to remain employed. Now let's talk about wording and grammar. This is probably my pet peeve when it comes to documentation, because it is so important and yet it is the most poorly done. One issue you want to avoid is documenting in code. For example, Jeff entered MBA 1 as an MBA 2, so FD wasn't en route until 1708, causing CPR immediately on scene. He also failed to say patient was in front of red van. Okay, right now, looking at that, you may have understood all of that, or you may not. It depends on what codes you use, as opposed to what codes I might use. So you want to avoid documenting in code. Remember, your documentation may be read later at a grievance or court hearing, and it needs to be clear in order to prove your point of employee performance. Oops, sorry about that. All right, using poor grammar. I'm going to step on some toes here, I know. I don't mean to pick on anyone, but these are phrases that just don't belong in documentation, and these are easily corrected by running something through Word and having it spell and grammar checked. One thing I see often is the phrase, "I seen the trainee struggling with their call." There, and there, whether, if and it. Another thing that I see a lot is apostrophes where apostrophes don't belong. Apostrophes show possession, not plurality. So the correct sentence here would be, "I saw the trainee struggling with their call." Now, most people reading this documentation would probably understand what you were trying to convey, but you always want to keep in mind that your documentation can and will be seen by others, and you want to present a professional image in those cases. Okay, using emoticons. I cannot stress enough how using emoticons is unprofessional. Emoticons have absolutely no place in employment documentation, regardless of how much you want to make the person feel like they've done a great job. So let me rephrase this. Do not use emoticons. I have seen DORs with emoticons in them. I have seen documentation for evaluations with emoticons, and it is just absolutely inappropriate. I don't know if y'all are understanding what I'm saying here. Do not use emoticons. Another thing that shouldn't be in there is personal opinions. Adding how you feel about the employee has no relevance to the employee's performance. And again, it makes you appear unprofessional. So as you are writing or documenting training, performance issues, and behavioral problems, you always want to write as if you are writing something to be read to a judge in a district court. It needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, and easy to understand. So one last story to illustrate this point. We had a dispatcher who had been a stay-at-home mom for years before she decided to apply. Now, throughout her training, she had difficulty remembering from one day to the next what procedure to follow, even on the simplest calls. So we were constantly correcting her call sheets, changing her NCIC entries, and she could not be left alone to answer the phones, much less dispatch. So we kept documentation on everything, and we told the lieutenant who was in charge of communications that she needed to be terminated. Well, he decided he needed another opinion 5 times. She worked for us for 4 years before we finally got a new manager who agreed that she needed to be terminated. The employee filed a grievance, and we testified in front of a grievance board about the issues we had with her performance. Now, in that 4 years, we had gotten a new CAD system, a new phone system, and we moved into a new building. But when we went to grievance, all the documentation we had ever had on her was provided to that grievance board for them to review. So my points here are, number 1, that had we documented everything in code, we wouldn't have been able to tell them what we were talking about in the earlier documentation, because all of our call codes went from 10 codes to plain English. And 2, we had no idea at the beginning of her employment that others would be reading that documentation 4 years later. So always, always, always keep that in mind. Now, another thing about documentation is when you're documenting performance issues, whether it's substandard performance or misconduct, you want to make sure that you're using the appropriate words and phrases to convey the problem. Stating that John has been late to work 3 times is fine, but you should also include what effect it has on his coworkers and the department. So, for example, John was late to work 3 times this week, arriving at 07:03 on 1-3, 7:19 on 1-5, and 7:08 on 1-7. This has caused others to work unscheduled overtime and has caused problems between employees within the department. Okay? State the danger to the public. John failed to verify the address of the incident, and responders were sent to a cell tower location. The delay caused the patient to go into cardiac arrest, requiring CPR and AED activation. And then state the danger to responders. John failed to ask for weapons information while taking a robbery call, causing safety issues for the public and the officers responding to the scene. Okay? When poor performance has or could have bad consequences, you always want to make sure that it is documented. Now, that is all I have for you today. But before we go to the questions, I wanted to let you know to tune in, same bat time, same bat channel, next month for our session on drones and 911. Are you ready for this? We're going to talk about how not only are drones being used to stalk and harass victims, but they're also being used in public safety to help with addressing, mapping, and combating crime. Also, we're going to talk about what actions you should take if you receive a 911 call about a drone being used for possible illegal activity. So let's get to our questions that we have. First question is, when documenting incidents, are you just keeping them for records purposes, or are you also sharing it with the employee every time an incident occurs? If you'll remember, I had I said something about if you allow freebies. So I always allowed a freebie. When I first started at an agency, and I was told I had these problem employees, but I didn't know any of these people. They didn't know me. I had not, had a chance to make anything perfectly clear to them. So what I did is I gave everybody a freebie, which meant basically that I was not going to write them up for something the first time. They all understood it was a freebie. That did not mean that I was going to ignore it. So what I did is I had folders on the network. I had folders for each employee where I just kept little documentation if I needed to remember stuff for evaluation. So if they did something great, I'd document it like in a Word document, and I'd put it in this folder. So anything that, any freebie that I gave them, I'd document it in a Word document and put it in that folder, but just so if it went on to become a habit, I still had the documentation, and I wouldn't tell them that I wrote it because it was just for my notes. If it became a pattern, then that's when I started sharing with them anytime I noticed something that was becoming a pattern. And, you know, I may call them in and say, hey, you know, I gave you a freebie, you did this before, but you've done it again, and so now we're going with a verbal counseling. I'm telling you, don't do this anymore. So the freebies I did not share with them unless it started to become a habit. Another question, do you have employees sign your documentation at the time the coaching is given? Yes. You, if you're giving them, well, actually, so if you're giving them an oral counseling, there's really not anything to sign. I would tell them that I was keeping this documented, and, you know, just in my documentation, I would tell them it was going to be documented, but I didn't have them sign anything there. If it happened again, and then I would do a written notification, then yes, I would have them sign that and anything above that. And yes, I would allow comments. I would allow them to enter comments at the bottom underneath their signature. Do I have PIP examples that I could share? I do. I have this one that I created for the PowerPoint. I do have that I can share. I can send it to you. But you can also Google and get tons of PIP examples. I always did mine in a memo format, just like what I put in here on our memo letterhead. And so you could take the one that I have here in the PowerPoint. If you'll just email me, email training@comelectronics, I will send you that documentation in a Word document, and you can change it, put it on your letterhead or whatever. And then, like I said, you can Google and look at all kinds of different samples of PIP documents. So, are there any other questions before we go on? I will leave this up for a few minutes in case anybody does have questions. Let me give you this information here, just so you will have this, okay? So, if you need the information on today's lesson for continuing education, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. And also, if you want a copy of this sample PIP that I did. I want to say thank you for joining us. Will we be able to get a copy of this webinar? Yes, you will get a copy of this webinar. You'll get a link in an email within 48 hours, and it'll have the PowerPoint on it and the audio recording. So, thank you for joining us. This presentation has been made possible by Commercial Electronics, provider of public safety solutions, including the HighGround NG911 recording, CEQIP third-party quality assurance program, and Carbine 911 next generation call handling platform. Y'all have a great day, and I will leave this up a few more minutes in case you have some more questions. Thank y'all.